Hello, everybody. It is Monday, January the 13th, 2025. Over 2 years ago, we did what I thought was a memorable show, excusing the pun, with the world-famous best-selling author Lisa Genova on how writers can use both memory and forgetting to improve their work. At that point, Lisa had just come out with a nonfiction book, Remember, the Science of Memory and the Art of Forgetting. Lisa is one of the world's leading authorities, writers on neuroscience, many books, including Still Alice, which many people will know. It's got over 22,000 ratings on Amazon. And Lisa today has, or tomorrow actually, has a new book out. It's a novel, More or Less Maddy. It's always a major event in literary circles. She's joining us from Cape Cod. Lisa, congratulations on the upcoming book. And I have to ask you, given our last conversation, what did you remember and what did you forget in this work of fiction?
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's so good to be back and so exciting to be talking about this new novel. What did I remember and what did I forget in writing this book? Well, I did a lot of research to write this book. I interviewed psychiatrists and psychologists, people who live with bipolar disorder and their family members. And then I sort of put all of that away and trust that I have absorbed and know what I need to know to leap off into fiction from that place of sort of nonfiction.
Well, maybe my question was poorly phrased, Lisa.
Okay.
In terms of remembering and forgetting, your last book, Remember, the Science of Memory and the Art of Forgetting, is designed for writers. You're both a nonfiction and a fiction writer. In terms of the art or the act of writing fiction versus nonfiction, is there a difference in remembering and forgetting for fiction and nonfiction, particularly in the context of this new book, More or Less Maddy?
I don't think so. It's not really my approach and or in my process and how I write. I don't think in terms of memory and forgetting when I'm writing fiction. So yeah, that's not really relevant to writing this book.
You did a lot of research for More or Less Maddy, and we're going to get into some of that research on bipolarity, on what some people see as the epidemic of mental illness now, particularly amongst young people, young women in the United States. Why is it so important in your view and you're known for your intense, serious research? Why do you need to research for a work of fiction?
Well, I'm writing about people who tend to be ignored, feared, and misunderstood for what's going on inside their brains. And while I'm writing fiction, it's a made-up story that doesn't represent any one person's experience. My books are going to be read by people who have those disorders, people who love them, and for people who don't know anything about someone with bipolar disorder or Alzheimer's or autism or any of the others I've written about, this is their chance to actually learn something real about it. So I feel a tremendous responsibility and opportunity to tell the truth under the imagined circumstances. And so my books get used by, I was just responding to someone on Facebook this morning who's a professor of behavioral neuroscience at a university in Boston who uses my books for her students to understand the lived experiences of the neurodegenerative diseases they're learning about. So they get used in OT, PT, nursing, medical schools. These books need to be accurate to really help people give them the trust that in the work that it's representative of what could actually happen.
Perhaps, and I'm curious as to your response here, Lisa, are we living in an unusually, and I'm not sure if this is the right word, rich time for mental illness and anxiety in one kind or another? I was doing some research before we started in terms of this term, the age of anxiety, often used to describe today's social media age, but the term was, I think, invented by W.H. Auden in 1944. but a lot of the research suggests that now America really is in an age of anxiety. How would you historicize our moment in terms of the history of mental illness? And this is 2025, no different from 1925 or 1825.
No, I think it is very different. I think that historically, for all of the sort of dark sides of social media and the internet, one of the upsides is we can talk about issues in a way that is global. And so if you are experiencing anxiety or bipolar disorder or depression, you can go online and learn about it. And there are communities talking about it and people posting about it. So there's much more open conversation than ever before, for sure. These still carry so much stigma, shame, secrecy. But I think that we're at a point where there's a lot more opportunities for empathy, compassion, conversation than ever before. There are resources available where if you had bipolar disorder in 1900, you weren't going to get a diagnosis. You would be called crazy. You might be sent away into a mental institution and no one would ever see you again. That's not the case today. So while I think that mental illness appears to be more prevalent today than ever before, in some ways it's because we're talking about it more than ever before.
I've forgotten the name of the author. I interviewed her probably 2 or 3 years ago, but she wrote a book about the current state of mental illness. And she argued that the mental illness is the civil rights of our age in terms of the equivalent of people demanding recognition. Do you think there's anything in that thesis?
I'm nodding because I sort of understand the comparison and that, the dismissiveness that happens if you have a mental illness, the sort of, and it's interesting, like the term mental illness is even, I think, problematic. If you have Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, we don't say you have a mental illness, right? We say you have a neurological disease or a neurodegenerative disease. But if you have bipolar disorder or a PTSD or schizophrenia, we say you're mentally ill. And it's such there's so much wrapped in that term that people immediately fear you, distrust you, dismiss you, turn away, right? And so it becomes it becomes an identity that carries so much stigma, and it's a handicap to be labeled that, and it's an injustice. So I understand the comparison.
So what language should we use, Lisa?
It's interesting. I haven't necessarily come up with something better on my own. I do think that it is a made up term. So just to be clear, like when psychiatrists were designing the DSM, the manual of, psychiatric diseases and disorders, this isn't based on blood tests, MRIs, biological data. This is a categorizing behaviors and labeling it something that can potentially be treated as a medical disease. So it is a term that's made up. I don't think it serves us well. I think that neurological disorder, while that will also carry its own sort of stigma. People are afraid of anything that's going on from the neck up. I think neurological, in my experience now, which, is a couple decades in writing about neurological diseases, disorders, conditions, I think neurological disorder carries less stigma than mental illness. I don't see a reason to use it. Weirdly, on the flip side, mental health is a lovely term, I think, and people can understand that and use that effectively. I just think the other side of that coin, mental illness, doesn't really serve anyone well.
Should we retire the word normal when it comes to all these issues, Lisa? Is there such a thing as a normal person these days, particularly when it comes to their mental health?
Well, yes and no. So, like, the term is, and I go into this quite a bit in the book. My main character is a young woman. She's 20, 21 years old and has sort of always strived to be quote unquote normal, right? Like as
And
a
this is
teenager.
Maddy.
Yeah, so
This is the Maddy from More or Less Maddy, your
yeah,
new
so
novel.
Maddie's, the goal of most young people is to try to fit in and be normal and to build a life. And like, oh, well, what is a normal life? It's like, well, go to college, get a job, get married, buy a house, have kids. Like sort of that's the outline prescribed by our culture as normal. But is that something that is does that generate happiness? Is that everyone's normal? Like, of course not. So and then in terms of neurological behavior, what's normal? The idea of like what is the range of what allows you to function in the life you've chosen is quote unquote normal, right? So, and that's going to be different. That range is going to be different depending on what you've chosen to do. I talk about it in the book that behavior in Las Vegas that's acceptable there is very different from behavior that's acceptable in suburban Connecticut, which is very different from behavior that's acceptable on the beaches of the south of France. So, normal is so subjective. And to impose your normal on someone else's normal, it is unfair and doesn't really work. So the term is problematic for sure.
So in a sense, and I want to get to Maddy in a second, in a sense, Lisa, we make our own histories, but we don't make our own realities.
No, we do not. Reality is so subjective. It's so subjective. Yeah, and our brains don't
But
tell us
who's
our brains don't
doing?
tell us the truth of everything anyway. Right down to color. I mean, you and I don't perceive necessarily the same blue as the same blue. Um, yeah, I think it's
But
the 10-year anniversary of that blue and gray or white and gold dress. I don't know if you remember that going around.
it's that of course is one of the reasons why everyone seems to be so anxious online, because on the internet blues look yellow and yellows look blue. But going back to that beach in the south of France, is there such a beach? Is there an actual reality?
Is there an actual reality? There, in terms of how we perceive, um, there are no, our perceptions are all subjective. Like our ability to understand the world before us is based on the sensory receptors that we've got. But if I were a bat or an octopus or a bumblebee, like my experience of the world is very, very different. My ability to perceive echolation or ultraviolet light, or sounds. My dog's experience of the world, his reality, is based on primarily scent and sound and not visual, like it primarily is for us humans. So reality is subjective depending on the receptors, sensory receptors you have, and then the brain that you've got to interpret those signals.
And that's of course, the job of a writer like yourself, both a neuroscientist and a very skilled nonfiction and fiction writer. So let's focus on the invented character at the heart of this new book, More or Less Maddy. Maddy, she grew up in Connecticut. What kind of reality did she see?
So she's a white suburban young girl in an affluent town. Her father disappeared when she was 4, and she doesn't remember much about him, except that there were a lot of boats stranded on her front lawn, which she took as normal at the time, as much as a swing set or a grill would be to have in your yard. So he disappears, and her mom remarries someone much older who has a lot of money. And so her reality is about trying to get the best grades that she can to get into college, to then go to college, to have a boyfriend, to have sort of status through having that boyfriend who's a basketball player in high school, and then to go off to college and discover what she'll do in life. And she's having trouble with that. She doesn't really know what she wants to do, and she looks around at her mother's and her stepfather's affluent life. They dine at the country club regularly, and she doesn't see this as what would make her happy in her future, and doesn't understand why everybody else wants to do this either.
And what about those those boats on the front lawn, they sound like some sort of surrealist painting. What's the explanation of what happened to her father?
Well, as the story unfolds and Maddie ends up diagnosed with bipolar disorder, her sister sort of reminds her, well, this is scary for mom in particular because this is what happened with dad. And her sister is 5 years older, so her sister has more of a memory of what happened. And Maddie really doesn't remember much, but her sister shares with her memories of, him when he was depressed, sleeping and not sleeping for days and never getting up, for being gone when he's manic and spending tons of money and buying all these boats and leaving them on the front lawn and sort of disappearing for periods of time and being chaotic at home and violent and scary. So he left and never returned, and they tried to find him and couldn't. So they don't know if he's remarried under a new name somewhere else, if he's sailing on one of those boats in the South Pacific, if he's homeless somewhere, if he's died. They don't know.
So this bipolarity, which is the neurological or the scientific heart of your book, is it inheritable? Is the people with parents who suffered from bipolar disorder, are they more likely to suffer it themselves than people whose parents didn't have it?
Yeah, there's a genetic component to it, but it's not a purely genetic illness. So family history is a risk factor. So if I have bipolar disorder, my children have a 10% chance of inheriting this, which is higher than the general population. It's about 2%. So 1 in 50 folks have bipolar disorder in the general population. If you're an identical twin, your twin has a 48% chance of having bipolar disorder if you have it. So it's not 100% genetic.
Yeah, those numbers are always chilling when a doctor throws numbers at you. I did a little bit of research before here, and when I was looking up bipolar disorder, 1 in 5 US adults live with a mental health condition. But that stat, the 20% of US adults who supposedly live with a mental health condition, that doesn't tell us anything about bipolar disorder, does it, Lisa?
No, because that's bundling in, general depression and anxiety disorders, schizophrenia. Also, these statistics are interesting too to me because the counting of it all, you can imagine that socioeconomics play into these being somewhat inaccurate, right? Because it's kind of difficult to get a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. It's the average is like something like 7 to 10 years to get the right diagnosis, and you've seen at least 3 doctors before you get there. And so if if you don't have money, if you don't have access to healthcare, you're probably not going to get a diagnosis. So I would imagine those numbers are highly underrepresentative of the actual number of people who are struggling with mental illness.
So, and I'm not sure, and probably most people disagree, but I'm not sure whether always not having access to healthcare is good or bad. Maybe the privileged people like I was going to say Lisa Genova, Maddie living in Connecticut, who have access to expensive doctors, may not always be beneficial to them. But anyway, let's get to
No, let me push back on that for a second. I think that in this case, it is like if you are undiagnosed with bipolar disorder, you are going to really struggle when you have debilitating depression and when you have a manic episode that might really blow up your life. Like you might it's going to be really difficult for you to maintain stability in a functional life if you don't have the guardrails of medications, support in your family and your doctor, an understanding of what your triggers are and how to manage those, and having a therapist to help you sort of understand your own ability to stay stable. So I disagree with that.
Yeah, and you know a million times more about it than me, and I think that probably reflects just not just my intolerance, but perhaps a broader intolerance that we talked about before a little bit when it comes to civil rights. So Let's talk about bipolar disorder. I had a friend when I was in graduate school many years ago who supposedly had this and ended his life. He certainly was profoundly troubled, a man of great brilliance. What does it mean, bipolar disorder?
So bipolar disorder is it is characterized by having episodes or phases of mania, and then other phases of depression. And so it's if you don't have the mania and you have depression, then the diagnosis is simply depression. But if you have mania, which means that you have an elevated mood, you feel invincible, you have pressured speech, you're talking really fast, you're not sleeping many hours, if at all, for days and weeks and maybe months on end, and you don't feel tired. Um, you're acting sort of recklessly, you're maybe spending lots of money, having sex with multiple partners, you're starting projects and not finishing them, you think that you have delusions of grandeur, you think that you are called upon by the government or God, or you are a member of a rock band or an important political group. So there are delusions and hallucinations that come with bipolar 1. um, and they 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 last for a period of time and then often go back to a stable sort of quote unquote normal phase, and then swing back into a depression or mania over time. So it's a disease that continues, that can continue to swing into these mood states.
Is there a functional version of this? Because the way you describe it might be a description of Napoleon or Elon Musk or some of these other high achievers who are yo-yoing, or is that again a rather unfair, unscientific question?
So the depressions are debilitating. I think people tend to spend more time in depression than mania. And so those, like, I think it's at least a third of the time on average that people are in depression. And that's not a functional state to get anything done. So these people who are quote unquote high functioning are not functioning when they are depressed. But prior to full on mania, and then if it's what's labeled bipolar 2, you have something sort of like mania light. It's called hypomania. And so you don't have the delusions or the hallucinations. You're not what's called psychotic. But you just have that elevated energy, elevated mood. You're very charismatic. You're able to get, you can be very productive. It doesn't necessarily mean you're working on something that makes sense or that you're even good at, but you believe you're good at it. So you might not be productive at something that's actually effective. But in that hypomanic phase, if you are talented, if you are brilliant, you can get a lot done. And a lot of famous creative people who've had bipolar 2 have been creative and productive in those hypomanic states.
Who comes to
Don't
mind? The
stay
one
there.
who comes to mind for me is Nietzsche, who, of course, was the inspiration for Foucault's work on insanity as a historian.
Okay.
I mean, who comes to mind for you?
Um, Gosh, I'm not even thinking of anyone at the moment. I don't have my handy list of famous people who may or may not have been bipolar.
So maybe let's
But
get to
but
Maddie,
also
who.
just to say, like, that hypomania sounds marvelous, and people who have bipolar disorder will talk about that state as being magical. And if it were just hypomanic, like, it wouldn't be a problem. But the problem is you don't stay there. And you swing down into depression. Like, the cost of the hypomania is that you will at some point be depressed, and it's awful. And then the hypomania also, it can be disruptive and destructive in that you might be working, 24 hours a day on some amazing project that, once you're not hypomanic, turns out to be not so amazing and could be actually even embarrassing. So it's not always a wonderful thing.
Are there many external manifestations, extreme weight gain or loss, absence of sleep? I mean, for people watching who suspect
Yes.
perhaps that a loved one might be suffering from bipolar disorder, how does it manifest itself externally? Because presumably these extreme ups and downs aren't always manifested. People retire to their bedroom for the more extreme versions.
Right. So depression's super easy to spot. I mean, as a culture, I think we're all, because it's so prevalent, because we've been talking about it for a few decades now, kind of openly. We know what that looks like. When you've lost interest in anything that you used to be interested in, you sleep probably too much, sometimes not enough, though, can go either way. You just lack all energy, lack will, hope, interest, and don't have energy to do anything. Um, for mania, one of the symptoms of mania, and actually one of the precursors and triggers to becoming manic, is a change in sleep, and it's not needing sleep. So if you have a loved one who's suddenly, maybe sleeping only 2-3 hours a night and isn't tired and is texting everybody all night long, or is posting to Instagram stories 50 at a time all through the night, is talking to you really fast, is starting to spend lots of money or go on an unexpected trip, is suddenly strikes up a new hobby and is like totally invested in this new hobby out of nowhere. These are changes in behavior that are symptomatic of a manic episode. But sleep is the number one thing that, across the board, this is a telltale sign that something is about to shift in energy if you stop sleeping.
So let's focus on Maddie. How does it manifest itself for her?
So Maddie is in the middle of a depressive episode. She'd been depressed before, but it had coincided with the breakup with her boyfriend. So she had sort of ascribed all of that depression to situational, that it was the breakup. At this point, though, she's back together with the boyfriend. Life is good. She's at NYU, and she's depressed. She doesn't want to get up and go to class. She's not interested in anything. She's hiding how horrible she feels. And she can't keep up with her classwork. So she got a warning letter from the dean saying she needs to get her grades up or she will be asked to leave. And so in a panic, she goes to the student health center to ask for sort of an excuse. Like, I've been really overwhelmed and anxious and depressed, and I need a minute. Like, can I get an extension on this paper kind of request? And she gets the extension she needs and the excuse she needs, but she also gets a prescription for an antidepressant. So she goes on that. The problem is antidepressants can be wonderful for people who have depression, but if what is underlying your depressive symptoms is actually bipolar disorder, an antidepressant will catalyze a manic episode. So this antidepressant launches Maddie into her first manic episode. And so she starts buying tons of expensive clothes. She starts hooking up with lots of men in comedy clubs while she has this boyfriend and doesn't tell him. She is,
when you say hooking up in comedy, you mean literally in comedy clubs or men she meets there?
Men she meets at comedy clubs, and in the comedy clubs. She's reckless. So she becomes reckless with her life without feeling that it's reckless. It just feels exciting, and she's in control of all of it. She also starts to believe that she is going to be collaborating with Taylor Swift to ghostwrite Taylor's memoir. So she
has a particular affinity with Taylor Swift's work.
Yes. And then she also believes, as she's hanging around these comedy clubs, that she's going to become a comedian, and she's been hired. She has a contract with Netflix to write a 1-hour comedy special. So this is now bipolar 1. She's got these delusions that aren't real, but she believes them.
I wonder, and I want to get to the comedy stuff because it's the heart of the novel in a second, Lisa. But what about the role of external stimulants of one kind? Psychedelics now becoming more and more mainstream. Of course, many kids at NYU, we both got kids who have been at NYU. Everybody knows that one kind of stimulant or another, alcohol, one kind of drug or other, is ubiquitous at places like NYU. Before we go back to Maddy, the recklessness you talk about in bipolar disorder, does that tend to encourage the use of external, often illicit drugs?
Yes, and the disorder itself. So while your energy and mood and sleep are becoming deregulated, you are often people often use stimulants and depressants to help sort of manage and sort of like massage and amplify or bring down or bring up the experience they're having. So if I'm manic and I'm maybe starting to come down from that a little, cocaine or amphetamine or stimulants that can help bump that mood back up to where it had been. If I'm too manic for the situation, I might drink alcohol because that's a depressant. Um, and one of the things that a good psychiatrist and psychologist will insist with their bipolar patients is that they stay away from um, all substances of abuse, so all stimulants, all other depressants, because it's too difficult to treat you if you're trying to manage and stabilize your mood and energy, and you're taking these other substances that are going to swing you. But it's super common for people with bipolar disorder to use those substances to affect their moods and play with their moods even more.
Is there something coincidental about Maddy's attraction to stand-up comedy? I have to admit, I'm not a big fan. It always seems, or many of the leading supposed entertainers, purveyors of stand-up comedy, seem to me to be manic. I don't know about being bipolar, but is it coincidental that this is the heart of the novel, or is there something about stand-up comedy in America which somehow lends itself almost inevitably to this story and to her own bipolar delusions?
So I think, some people have asked me along the way, like, oh, it seems like stand-up comedians have bipolar disorder more than other people. Is that true? Are you more likely to have bipolar disorder if you're a stand-up comedian? And I don't know that that's true. There's no data on that. I will say this though, stand-up comedians tend to talk about very openly using their own life experience in their acts, in their bits. And so we get to know what's going on with them, as opposed to accountants, doctors, lawyers. They're not letting you know inside their internal worlds on a stage. So I don't think it necessarily means like, oh, if I'm interested in stand-up comedy, having bipolar is one of the uh, ingredients that helps me go in that direction. I think that I chose her to be a stand-up comic because I liked the idea of, and in being a stand-up comic, you sort of experience a bit of the bipolar experience on stage. So if I'm killing it, if I am making everyone laugh and we are in on this together, it is the biggest high. It's so euphoric and exciting and almost addictive. Like comedians talk about wanting, that's why they do it. They want that feeling over and over again. And then if they're bombing, no one's laughing, everybody hates it. It feels like a death. It's the worst feeling in the world. You feel alone and like you just want to die. And that to me sort of is like depression. So it was like, oh, this swing that can happen within moments on a stage if you're a stand-up comedian is interestingly like it's a very bipolar experience. I also wanted to give Maddy an aspiration that was outside of what's quote unquote normal in our culture today for a young woman. So this idea of striving for normalcy whether it's because you have something like bipolar disorder or it's because you're a young woman starting out in life. Like, who's to say what is normal and when is it healthy to strive for that and when is it maybe okay to say no, I'm choosing something that's outside of what you all are calling normal. So I thought stand-up comedy was perfect for that. And I also thought it would give me a chance. It was hard. I had to go learn how to write stand-up comedy, which was an interesting challenge. But it also gave me an opportunity to invite some humor and levity into this story, which can be very, dark at times.
Yeah, and I know you've done a lot. You did a lot of research. Maria Bamford,
Yeah,
Amy Schumer,
yeah,
Matt Pavich.
yeah.
Who's your favorite?
Oh gosh, I have a lot of favorites. That is one of the great joys of doing the research for this book is I have been to a lot of comedy shows and have met some in person. I'll rattle off a few. So, Maria Bamford and Amy Schumer are certainly two of them. You got those.
And
Um,
you talked to them both, right, for the
yes,
book?
and doing the research, yes. Taylor Tomlinson is probably one of my top favorites for sure. She actually has bipolar and uses it in her act. She's phenomenal. Um, I love, oh my gosh, there's so many. Mike Birbiglia, Jackie Novak, Gary Gulman. Um, yeah, so many good ones. Who else am I going to see soon? I almost always have tickets to see a comedian somewhere, and it's so much fun.
Is there anything funny about bipolar disorder more broadly?
No, I mean it's a really hard disorder to live with. No, I mean I came to know a lot of people who live with it in their families, and it's so challenging. It's such a disruptive and destructive disorder to live with. It's so stigmatized, and um, people will distrust you for having it. And the treatments for it aren't great. It's interesting. Like, there's a lot of judgment, I think, out there about if someone has bipolar disorder and, oh, they went off their meds. So, like, yeah, of course they are in trouble again. This sort of judgment over, like, well, if you would just stay on your meds, sorry, then you'd be fine. Um, but honestly, the treatments are not specific, and they have such hideous side effects often that at times you could wonder, is my lived experience with these side effects worse than the symptoms of the illness? Or maybe the treatments are actually working and you've been stable for so long that you kind of forget how bad that last manic episode was. And because, by the way, you also don't lay down great memories while you're manic. Your brain doesn't really process memory great when you're in that state. And you kind of forget. I liken it, without having bipolar myself, I kind of liken it to like how women forget how much pain labor and delivery is, and we are willing to have more children. But time goes by, and if you're stable on the meds and you're taking these every day and you're not feeling, you get some, you've got some symptoms, but otherwise your mood's been stable for so long, you can sort of convince yourself like, well, maybe I don't have it anymore. And you go off, and then of course you do end up having a recurrence of depression or mania, and things go sideways again. But it's a really difficult disorder to live with, between both the actual experience of it and then how the world treats you for having it. So I don't think it's funny, but it's also human. So in addition to all of those things, you are not the disorder. Like, I talk about that in the book too. Like, she has bipolar, I think, is the right language, not I am bipolar, right? You're more than this this illness.
So, whilst this is a book central in some ways about stand-up comedy, it's not a funny novel. And it's not a tragic one either, is it?
No, and I wouldn't say this is about stand-up comedy. My main character happens to be an aspiring stand-up comedian. That's an element of the story, but the story is about someone who's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder at a very young age, and this is how this disorder works. The average onset is late teens to early 20s. So you're just about at an age where you're starting to assemble an identity, right? You're choosing a career, you might be choosing a life partner, you're choosing where you want to live. And then this disease comes in, this disorder comes in and wants to take over your identity. So it
Mm.
really is a crisis of, who am I, and how do I incorporate this into who I am without it overcoming me, without it defining me. So I think that's the story. And the stand-up comedy, it should be fun. It should make you laugh out loud. And it is exciting to see this young woman pursue something that her family of origin is saying, oh, I don't know, you've got a disease of instability and you want to choose a career that's so unstable, and you're a woman in comedy. Like, that's a tough thing to go after. So this young woman is pretty fierce. Yeah, and her comedy was really fun to write.
Isn't that? I mean, it'd be better for her to be a stand-up comic than an accountant.
Yeah,
What
that's
is
not a
the
novel
what
you
is the
want to read.
natural trade or calling of somebody who suffers from this in terms of living a functional life? Should they tend towards something like stand-up comedy or something like accountancy?
Well, it's a very broad question, because it depends on the individual. If your meds are able to, you're able to stay on the meds and they work for you. Bipolar is tough, I would say, for stand-up comedy, because you're in, and this was discussed in the book with her doctor and mother as well. You're choosing a career that's in bars and nightclubs, where the hours could be that you're working at midnight. And it's super important to get consistent and regular sleep with this disorder. Super
Mm.
important to stay away from alcohol and drugs. So
So
if
probably, yeah,
that's
you're
gonna
probably
be
better off being an accountant than a stand-up
it's
comic.
more stable for sure, but this is your one life. Like, if you're called to do something, that's, on stage in a nightclub, then there are ways to figure out how to live a full and stable life with bipolar disorder. And I really hope I've made that clear in the book. I think I have.
Lisa, finally, this is a global disease, obviously, a bipolar disorder. I'm not sure how America fares on the league table of bipolar disorder, but is there something particularly American about the issue of agency? The promise of America, right from its foundation, is that we manage our own lives, we shape our own lives. That's what was known as the American dream is. That we manage ourselves. What you note about bipolar disorder is that it manages us. So how does the America context fit in here? I mean, could this have been a book set in London or Paris or Tokyo?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a global issue. This affects, again, 2 to 5% of the population worldwide. And I think that your language right there, like, this is a disease that manages us, isn't quite right. I think that undiagnosed, this disease will ruin lives. Like, it is unmanaged, it will control you. You will end up in these manic states or depressive states, and have no say over it. But a diagnosis allows you to have a say, to have agency over it. And that works. If you have a collaborative team, if you've got a good psychiatrist, psychologist, if you've got, family who is helping you to recognize symptoms and triggers. If you are finding a cocktail of medications that is livable for you, then you can live with bipolar disorder. You can live effectively and functionally with it, for sure.
Do you have a favorite joke that Maddie tells?
Um, I would say that not in particular, but toward the end, like, she gets better. She starts off not so great, and the book ends with what would be her 5 minute set, and I'm super proud of it. I think it's really funny, and it's her embracing who she is with bipolar disorder, in a way that I think all great comedy can do, which is take our shared human condition and talk about what you might be afraid to talk about, or what might be a little bit taboo, but in a way that allows us to laugh at ourselves and laugh together and see our common humanity.
Well, Lisa, Genova, wonderful to have you back on the show. A real honor. I hope it won't be another 2 years till I see you again. You need to get going on another book. But congratulations on More or Less Maddy. I've started reading it. It's wonderfully written, fascinating, tragic, funny, all the right words to use for a novel. So congratulations on that. And I hope you have a very healthy, and I use this word carefully, Lisa, normal 2025.
Thank you, Andrew. You too. Thanks so much.
Can I step on the sea?